Good evening, I'm Jake Ward in for Joshua Johnson. It's good to be with you on this Wednesday, July 13th. Here is some of what we're talking about tonight. Inflation hits its highest rate in 40 years, adding to the already increased pressure for Americans trying to make ends meet. It's part of why right now the president is headed to the Middle East, where part of his focus will be on securing a boost in oil production to bring down gas prices here at home. Then, a commission to investigate wrongful convictions was created by a progressive district attorney, and then he was recalled. Can a unique experiment in justice reform survive? We'll talk to the lawyer in charge of the Innocence Commission. And Instagram says it will use facial recognition technology to tell children from adults. We'll tell you why the safety precaution is also raising some alarm bells about the increasing role of technology in children's lives. By now, you and your wallet know that prices are going up for everything, whether it's rent, gas, or groceries. And the driving force behind it all, inflation, which just reached a 40-year high. Inflation is up over 9% compared to this time last year and up 1.3% just from last month. And it's making it harder for Americans to afford what they need. Since last month, food prices are up over 10%. Energy prices are up over 41%, and housing costs over 5%. The only bright spot? Well, filling up your tank has gotten a bit cheaper. Right now, the national average is about $4.63. That's about 38 cents lower than last month, but over $1 more than it was this time last year. Senator Baldwin touched on these soaring prices earlier today.
I know that people are really suffering with the inflation, and while it is great news that in the last month gas prices have gone down by about 40 cents per gallon, that's really not the break people are looking for.
We know two things for sure. Inflation is up, and we are paying way too much for everything. But why is it worse than expected? And what, if anything, right now can be done about it? With me in the studio now is Caleb Silver. He's the editor of Investopedia. Thanks so much for being here.
Good to be here with you.
So you and I feel like we're just together, not together, but virtually, and talking about this same thing. And at that time, I was asking you, what were your reaction to what at the time seemed like incredible inflation numbers? Now we're looking at it again. Where is your head at when you look at these numbers now?
Well, my head's back in 1981 when we had inflation at these levels. I was just 11 years old at the time. The thing about inflation and the consumer price index, which we got this morning, it's a rear view mirror indicator. That's where prices were really at the beginning of the month. And we know, as you mentioned, gas prices were about $4.93, close to $5, $6, $7 out on the West Coast. Those have come down. Oil prices have come down. Commodity prices in general have come down over the last few weeks, but not because inflation was too high and people weren't paying. It's because of fears now of a recession and a potential pullback in spending. That's driving prices down right now. So we may have seen the peak for inflation. And when we look at core prices, strip out food and energy, even though we have to pay for everything else all the time, those are up 5.9%, down from 6% in May, down from 6.5% in March. So the core prices are coming down. Energy and food are super volatile.
And what can we take away from that? Do you think we are at the peak? Are we looking in the rearview mirror at the back of the hillside, or do you think there is still some climbing we can do?
Well, the bogey there is energy prices, and oil prices are the main factor there. So Russia's continued invasion of Ukraine could exacerbate oil prices. There could be another black swan event that we don't see coming. Any
kind of unforeseen thing could blow this up again.
But if you look at commodities, and commodities are always traded in the future on the futures market, the price for oil out in September, October, November, down near $90 a barrel. If you look at steel, if you look at aluminum, those have come way off their highs. Prices for futures for those products also much lower than they are today. So prices are going to come down. If you look at the futures market and if you see what just happened in the past few weeks, it's already starting to unravel.
And now let's talk about the R word, recession. We have heard a lot of talk about it, the possibility of dipping into a recession here. And I feel like I always have to reacquaint myself each time these numbers come out with this idea that the Fed really only has a couple of tools at its disposal, and one of them really has to do with pulling back the American consumer from being able to spend as much money as we might want to or as effectively as we might want to. So help me understand, what can the Fed do here, and do we think that we still could be heading into a recession, or is that threat passed?
I think we probably will end up either in a recession if we're not already in one. If you look at one of the trackers from the GDP now from the Atlanta Fed, it shows that the second quarter growth declined to a negative 2%. That would be 2 straight quarters of declines, one of the characteristics of a recession. So that's going to happen. But what can the Fed do? Raise interest rates. They raised them 0.75% when they met earlier in June. They're going to raise them another 0.75% at least when they meet in a couple of weeks here. Raising interest rates makes borrowing more expensive.
Yeah.
That cools business spending. That cools consumer spending. Look at the housing market. Home purchases have fallen for 5 straight months as the Fed has been raising rates. So you're seeing demand destruction there, and that's what the Fed can do. And they're going to continue doing it throughout the year until we get to about 3.5%.
And the June jobs report came out a few days ago. Let's look at those numbers. In the last year, wages have increased 5.1%. That's good, but that is not enough to keep up with the rate of inflation. Nowhere near enough. How do we close that gap? And if we can't, what happens?
Yeah, we're not going to be able to. And if you looked inside today's CPI report, earnings fell 1% in the past month. So we've had a nice steady series of declines as workers have been in demand. Last month they fell for the first time. So they weren't keeping up with inflation to begin with. Now they're a little bit further behind. That's going to be a struggle, especially as companies still need more workers. The one strong part of the U.S. economy right now, the 1.5, is the labor market.
Yeah.
And consumers are kind of hanging in there, but they're starting to run up their credit card balances.
Right. This is the thing that I think I need your help understanding, because, you know, this is the land of growth, right? The whole idea of America is you make it here, and right, your money can do the work for you, and you're going to work hard, and it's going to happen. And yet we see this moment in which there are these external forces. There's Ukraine, there's the rest of it happening, but then there is the measures that the Fed decides it has to take. It has to slow down our ability to spend money, or at least borrow money. That tension is weird to me. I don't know, like, help me wrap my mind around that,
Yeah.
right? What do we think about when we think about a moment when wages can't keep up with inflation, and yet the Fed is actively trying to make it harder to borrow money to buy big things?
Yeah, so the American story is about growth, but it's also about spending. Consumer spending is 70% of U.S. GDP. We are spenders, and that keeps the economy humming. So the Fed has to raise interest rates to cool down prices. The risk is that they put the economy into a defreeze where nobody wants to borrow, and then you have this freezing of spending, and that pervades through the consumer sector, but also through businesses. When they cut back on spending, when they cut back on hiring, when they don't do that acquisition or build that plant they're planning to build, that really starts to hurt the economy in a much bigger way.
Right. So while I have you, the last thing that has really hit me is this idea that the euro and the U.S. dollar, which once upon a time were very far apart, are now suddenly 1-for-1. The exchange rate is basically 1-for-1. It's gotten to parity, first time in 20 years that that's happened. What does that mean? I mean, on the one hand, I think, okay, I can go to Europe and perhaps buy, a baguette, more cheaply than I could have before. But I'm assuming there are other big effects this is going to have. What do you think it'll do? Yeah,
that is a huge smoke signal that while we're facing a potential recession here in the U.S., it's going to be much worse in Europe. And the fact that the euro has fallen now to where the dollar has risen so aggressively shows you that investors have been piling into the dollar for safety, getting out of other currencies, including the euro, including the Japanese yen, which is considered a safety asset, piling into the dollar because they think the U.S. economy is going to be the cleanest dirty shirt in the hamper. The European economy is going to be headed for a really rough time over the next couple of years.
This is tough stuff, and I really appreciate you helping us unpack it. Caleb Silver is the editor-in-chief of Investopedia. Thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
Inflation is, of course, not just hitting Americans at the grocery store or the gas pump. It seems like everything costs more nowadays, and rent is no exception. Rental rates are skyrocketing nationwide. Some cities, like Austin, have seen a 50% increase. Many renters are getting priced out of their homes. In Los Angeles, one group of renters decided to fight back, and NBC's George Solis explains more.
Home to nearly 30,000. Los Angeles' Chinatown is a gateway to the past, but not immune to present-day pressures like a higher cost of living.
I have the rent increases for over the years, starting this one, 2004.
At first, the rise in rent was modest, like the apartment Alejandro Gutierrez has called home for the last 26 years.
2007, 835, and so on. 2008, 883.
Still nominal increases.
Yeah.
Then, in 2021, a bill for $2,450 appeared, more than double the $1,160 he'd been paying.
I couldn't believe that.
He's not alone. Bonded over fears of eviction, Fellow residents of Hillside Villa apartments have in some cases seen their rent more than tripled, blindsided by the end of a 30-year agreement between the city and landlord that kept rents affordable.
¿Cuál es el temor? What's the fear now that this price increase is happening?
That we cannot afford to pay this rent. I cannot afford to pay that market rate. None of us here in this building cannot afford to pay those rent increases. That's why we started fighting back.
A much larger housing war is brewing, especially for many seniors on fixed incomes. Rents up as much as 15 to 50% across the country.
Senior renters are more likely to be cost burdened.
Jun Zhu with the Urban Institute says the nation's current housing policy is not equipped to meet the incoming demand, and that more than half of these households threatened by skyrocketing rent will be non-white.
The bottom line is that we do not have enough supply of the affordable rental units for the seniors.
Right now, 1 in 5 renter households who qualify for housing help receive it. Waitlists are also long, and the paperwork can be challenging. In the next 20 years, some estimates say there'll be another 5.5 million senior renters in the U.S. With cost of rent soaring nationwide, some tenants fear how they'll be able to afford the future. In May, the Los Angeles City Council voted unanimously to buy the building from the landlord and has discussed using eminent domain to seize it, a government power that has largely been reserved to force residents out to make room for new development. Trinidad Louise, organizer with the LA Tenants Union, says the case could set a precedent.
This is the first time in the history of LA, in its 150 years or so, that eminent domain has been used to save affordable housing and to keep tenants housed.
While the landlord declined to speak to NBC News, in a letter to the LA City Council, his attorney argues the purchase or seizure of the 124-unit building is not needed, saying the majority of the households already have Section 8 vouchers to help subsidize their rent. Adding, the other 37 residents are almost certainly eligible and should be provided vouchers, arguing that buying a building for the private benefit of a very few would be grossly wasteful.
Perdiendo todo.
But residents like Adela Cortez remain hopeful the landlord strikes a deal with the city.
Adela says if they end up getting evicted, she's going to lose everything. If she's taking care of her grandkids, but it's not just that, her community is here.
A community that is living in fear they could lose their home, or in their words, their family.
We are familia. We help each other. So we don't want to lose that.
Still to come, President Biden is in Israel, kicking off his trip to the Middle East. But will he try to put his stamp on solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And later, how safe are your kids on Instagram? The social media giant wants to take security to another level with the help of facial recognition. We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. President Biden arrived in Israel earlier today, kicking off his first trip to the Middle East as president. Now, while previous presidents have tried to center their visits to Israel around resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there's really been no indication that Mr. Biden plans to do that. Instead, he reaffirmed his support for a two-state solution just moments after landing.
We'll discuss my continued support, even though I know it's not in the near term, a two-state solution. That remains, in my view, the best way to ensure the future of equal measure of freedom, prosperity, and democracy for Israelis and Palestinians alike.
The president is expected to visit Jerusalem and the occupied West Bank over the next 2 days. He will then head to Saudi Arabia on Friday. NBC News senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell has more from Jerusalem. Kelly?
Good evening, Jacob. A visit to Israel for Joe Biden is something very familiar. He talked today about knowing prime ministers from this country going all the way back to the 1970s. What is different is he comes here now as president of the United States, and his words and his actions take on even greater importance. One of the concerns that is certainly always active here is the relationship with Iran. The U.S. has been trying to get Iran back into the nuclear deal to stop them from having nuclear weapons that former President Trump abandoned. Those talks have really gone nowhere of late, but it is a position the U.S. holds. Israel is against that deal and feels a real existential threat from Iran. A journalist was preparing for this trip and had an interview with President Biden and asked about this issue of what the U.S. would do to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. His answer was notable.
you, in the past, said you'll do anything, and you say it again, that you'll ensure Iran would not acquire nuclear weapons. Does that also mean, sir, that you would use force against Iran? Is that what that means, if needed?
That was the last resort, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Officials tell me that is not a change in U.S. policy, but it is a change in the way the president talked about it, saying as a last resort he would use military force if necessary to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons. That resonates here in Israel and in the Middle East, and it is also important as the U.S. has complex conversations about and in respect to Iran, because at this point also U.S. officials are saying Iran may be ready to help Russia against Ukraine. So that adds some more importance to this. The president also was getting some headlines today by doing fist bumps instead of handshakes. White House officials say that's because of COVID and trying to keep him safe from that. At the same time, it may offer an opportunity for the president to avoid what would be a handshake moment, a real photo moment, when he goes to Saudi Arabia later this week and meets Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. That is a controversial meeting, and a handshake photo would only add to that. But we also saw today that sometimes that intent to just do fist bumps would fall by the wayside when he saw former Prime Minister and longtime associate Bibi Netanyahu. They seemed to clutch hands and embrace a bit more. So trying to avoid COVID, maybe trying to avoid political optics as well. Jacob?
Kelly O'Donnell in Jerusalem. Thank you, Kelly. Let's go from the Middle East to Sri Lanka in neighboring Asia. That's where the political situation is unraveling. The country is now under a state of emergency after the president fled the country to the Maldives instead of resigning, as he was expected to do today. This came after protesters stormed his residence this weekend. Protesters have now turned their frustration onto the prime minister, who is now the country's acting president. They stormed his office as well, demanding his ouster. But the acting president says he will not leave until there is a new government in place, calling some protesters, quote, a fascist threat. All this is a result of a dire economic situation that has been upending daily life in Sri Lanka for months now, with the country running out of basics such as food, medicine, and fuel. We'll get to some of today's other top stories in a moment, including soaring temperatures across the country. Your forecast is ahead with how long this heat wave will last, and the House Oversight Committee tries to map a way forward after the overturning of Roe v. Wade. We'll take you to Capitol Hill for an update. Plus, it may not be the end of the saga between Elon Musk and Twitter. Why Musk may have to pay for ending the $44 billion deal. We start tonight's headlines with the record-breaking heat wave in Texas. Multiple days of triple-digit temperatures are stretching the power grid there to the limit. The state's power company, ERCOT, is asking people to conserve power even as the mercury tops 110 degrees in some parts of the state. NBC News meteorologist Bill Cairns has more on the record-breaking heat. Good evening, Bill.
Jake, this has been a ridiculously hot summer already, and we still have half to go. Today actually marks the halfway mark in our summer season. So if you're one of those people that counts down the days till fall, well, we're halfway there. And if you're one of those people that love summer, well, you're also counting in the wrong direction now. So we've been sizzling. There's no doubt about it. Especially in the southern half of the country, the heat wave just kind of shifted all around. But one portion of the nation, it has been the most persistent, and that's the deep south. So this map shows you compared to average if it's been warmer or cooler this summer. Where it's blue, that's where it's cooler. Where it's yellow, warmer. Where it's red, that's where it's been really hot this summer season. So notice that, the Northwest, Northern Rockies, and also Northern New England and much of the Northeast has kind of seen an average to cooler than average summer. But this area of the country to the south has been roasting, especially Texas, which is now in extreme drought conditions for almost 40% of the state. I mean, it has moved in a hurry. It is dry, and every single day the sun is just baking things. So right now, Houston, San Antonio, Victoria, and Del Rio all are on pace for their hottest summer ever recorded in those cities' histories. And Dallas, by the way, San Angelo, heading to Baton Rouge, New Orleans, all through Atlanta, Tupelo, Memphis, Nashville included, all those cities, top 3 hottest summers that they've ever had. So some of those records go back over 100 years, too. So as we go through tonight and into tomorrow, we still have heat advisories throughout much of the deep south. That's where it's been the hottest. And a few spots have been very hot this week, like Salt Lake City has been over 100 day after day. And the heat wave just goes on and on. Tomorrow, 103 degrees for Dallas for a high temperature. Now, thankfully, it's not like the Dallas with the humidity. It's Dallas kind of like with the desert Southwest feel to it, like with, a dry heat if you want to, but 103 is still 103. It doesn't feel good no matter what you say. And notice Salt Lake City, again tomorrow, up to 102 degrees. Salt Lake City is not one of those places you think could be 100 degrees day after day, but that's the case. And by the way, Austin, Texas, today, 105 degrees for 5 days in a row. And it looks like we're going to continue watching that streak. So Dallas, even into Friday, 102. Salt Lake City, 101. And as we said, no relief even as we head into the weekend. Dallas, 103, 102 Saturday, Sunday. San Antonio, 103, 104 Saturday and Sunday. I wish I had better news for you, but here's the outlook for next week, the end of next week into next weekend, and way warmer than average all through the Central Plains. Not what you want to see if you've already been suffering. And then the drought conditions just continue to spread like this too. So we easily next week could see somewhere around 110 degrees in Kansas or in Oklahoma. And also, you notice the dry conditions don't help with our drought conditions in that portion of the nation. So again, have the AC cranking as we go throughout your Thursday, middle of the country and also for the East Coast, Jake.
100 degrees day after day. That was NBC's Bill Cairns. Bill, thank you. Abortion advocates, doctors, and state officials testified on Capitol Hill today about the impact of reversing Roe v. Wade, specifically in states that are restricting or limiting access. Nearly half of the U.S. has banned or will soon ban abortion, leading congressional Democrats to look for solutions. While the House is planning to vote on 2 abortion rights bills later this week, Senate opposition is likely. NBC's Ali Vitale has more.
Jake, an intense day of dual hearings here on the Hill regarding the reproductive rights issue. Democrats trying to paint the reality of what it looks like to be post-Roe. Listen to some of these exchanges between Republicans and Democrats, as well as their expert witnesses.
The choice lawmakers have is how difficult you will make it for us to exercise our freedom.
Overturning Roe versus Wade was a historic occasion that signals a new beginning for millions of unborn American babies.
Even now, health clinics are being overwhelmed. They are on the front lines of a full-blown healthcare crisis.
I cannot overstate how much legal uncertainty and chaos that this Supreme Court has unleashed with this unsound opinion.
And Jake, that reality that she's talking about there is something that I often hear from advocates. The patchwork of restrictions now across the United States because of the toppling of Roe in the Dobbs decision is something that they are regularly pointing to, and that states across the country are preparing for a greater influx of patients who are trying then to travel across state lines to access care. It's why Democrats, as part of this abortion legislation blitz that they're about to go on this week, are focusing on protecting the ability of women to cross state lines to access care, as well as trying to shore up data privacy protection, something that you've reported on and that I've reported on from here on the Hill, a top concern from Democrats as they try to contend with this post-Roe reality here. And of course, as I've been talking to my sources, there is this feeling that the White House and the president need to do more on this issue. There are many Democrats that I've spoken to who want him to declare a public health emergency on abortion. It's something that President Biden has said he is considering, but of course, no official action taken there yet. And so as the Hill continues to debate this issue and tries to pass legislation, the House expected to move on some bills on Friday, and of course, the Senate hoping to move on legislation as well, but the numbers reality there means that nothing is likely to be passed. But as they continue to have this debate legislatively, all Democrats and the president urging voters to let their voices be heard in November. We've seen in our polling that this is an issue that has only grown in importance in the minds of voters. You have to imagine that that polling spike is because for 49 years, this was a decided issue, one that voters didn't think that they were actually voting on in an active fashion. But of course, now with the court's decision, it is very much an active issue in the minds of voters and something that Democrats are trying to take advantage of as they push voters to the polls in November.
Ali Vitale with the legislative blitz in the fight for abortion access. Ali, thank you. Twitter is striking back at Elon Musk after the billionaire announced he wants to back out of a deal to buy the company. The social media giant has asked a judge to now force Musk to carry out his end of the bargain, namely purchasing Twitter for $44 billion. Twitter is now suing Musk for that same amount. In the lawsuit filed yesterday, lawyers for the company says Musk believes he, quote, is free to change his mind, trash the company, disrupt its operations, destroy stockholder value, and walk away. Musk on Friday said he was pulling out of the merger because Twitter had failed to provide him with information, according to the merger agreement. But in its lawsuit, Twitter maintains it followed the agreed upon conditions and accused Musk of trying to sink the deal simply because he lost billions in the recent market downturn. Survivors from the Uvalde shooting protested in Washington today, each demanding more change in the nation's gun laws. They were part of the March 4th rally at the Capitol this afternoon to push for a ban on assault weapons. A mother of 3 small children from Illinois organized this rally in less than a week. She told NBC News Now anchor Aaron Gilchrist the Highland Park mass shooting inspired her to fight for gun safety.
Thank you for making time to talk to us about what I know is just a really difficult topic for you and for your community, but it's a topic that drove you to take action. Tell me a little bit about how this event came to be.
I was in a neighboring community to Highland Park, 10 minutes away, with my children at their first 4th of July parade. And we heard the news from friends that were running for their lives. And there was 24 hours of complete despair and grief. And we decided to turn that grief into action. The one goal is to federally ban assault weapons now.
And this was really born out of a little bit out of concern for your own children and the children in communities really all over the country, right? This was, you're seeing these incidents happen over and over again in these places that we all think are safe.
Yes, enough is enough. That's all I can say. Enough is enough.
What's the plan? What's the purpose that you hope to accomplish?
The purpose is to use our voice to federally ban assault weapons now. We have 100 survivors from communities in Highland Park and Uvalde coming together with one voice to meet with legislators on Tuesday to federally ban assault weapons now. We have been united with people across the country, humans, not just parents, human beings, because it's a human rights issue, to federally ban assault weapons right now.
How much hope do you have that that is something that's possible? I mean, there's been a lot of talk about, the last piece of legislation that passed a few weeks ago being as far as many of our federal lawmakers are willing to go. How much hope do you have that you'll be able to find some success in this mission you've set out for yourself?
I was told hope is not a strategy, so instead action is our strategy. We want Highland Park to be the last community impacted by a mass shooting.
So what happens next? After, folks go back home on Wednesday, what's your next move to continue to push for some action?
I don't know. Wednesday, I need to get through Wednesday. Our goal is to federally ban assault weapons right now, and we won't rest until that happens.
Chirac, it's a common term for Chicago, and that's what 47-year-old single mother of 3, Christiane Montgomery, calls her hometown. 2021 was the city's deadliest year in a quarter of a century because of gun crime. NBC correspondent Zincle Esamua followed Montgomery through the elaborate security routine she goes through every time she leaves her home with her family.
I have the Ring doorbell as one security measure.
Ready to arm. Okay, so a security system for the house.
Right, and then I go to the different areas.
Oh wow, so you can see everything.
Every family has a morning routine, but on the south side of Chicago, Christiane Robinson's looks a bit different. She checks security cameras before exiting her house, all 5, and then...
Okay, let's go.
Off to school.
And I walk really fast because I want to get everybody in. Absolutely. So I don't take time. I don't know who may be in the alley. I have to keep the doors locked. I'm honking. From that point, I speed. through the alley.
It's a reality she says weighs on her family's mental health, but it's all in an effort to protect her 3 children from pervasive gun violence.
We live in Chicago, but we're in a war zone.
Do you like living around here? No. No?
Yes, it's not safe because there's too many shootings.
While shooting incidents in Chicago are down 18% compared to last year, the number is still high. 1,371 incidents this year as of July 10th.
Over 50% of the non-fatal shootings and homicides that have occurred over the past several years only occur on 5% of the blocks.
Tamara Hall is the Chief Coordination Officer for Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot's Community Safety Coordination Center, or CSCC, in operation for less than a year.
One of the mothers I spoke with talked about her home as being skyrocket. Do you agree that some parts of Chicago residents feel like they're in a war zone?
I wouldn't use a term like that, but I think that's reflective of how many residents feel.
It's how residents like Christiane feel. Just steps away from her front door in the spring, her neighbor, seen in this Ring video provided by Christiane, robbed by 3 people at gunpoint, her purse and wallet stolen.
Do you worry about PTSD?
Yeah. I have to basically keep putting the brave face.
Christiane is not alone in braving the violence, and experts like Alexa James, CEO of the Chicago National Alliance on Mental Illness, say the stress compounds, particularly in communities of color.
Systemic racism in of it is a traumatic event. So we're just starting at a deficit and just pouring more and more and more trauma unnecessarily into communities.
The CSCC acknowledges historic segregation and divestment in Chicago contributes to today's violence. Now they're working with multiple public health agencies to campaign against gun violence, increasing community mental health support and expanding access to youth higher education and work opportunity.
The community of North Lawndale, for example, as of right now, is down 50% in shootings as compared to 2021.
Still, for some residents like Christiane, the response is too little, too late.
The city likes to put more resources in downtown versus in the neighborhood, so I'd rather be where the resources are.
Each day, though there are schools and jobs in the South Side, Christiane says they're still not safe and drives at least an hour to drop off and pick up her kids morning and night, doing her safety routine every time.
Do you feel that in your body, the stress? Like, I got stressed with us doing that.
This is life on the South Side.
Living in a situation where it's unpredictable breeds mental health issues. What we need to do is a better job of asking people in those communities what they need.
When asked about her hopes and needs for her family, Christiane dreams of safety.
I would even create an island on Lake Michigan so I could just look at the skyline and be away from all of the violence that's happening.
In your dream, there's still gun violence happening.
It's not going to go away.
Still ahead, a project to free wrongfully convicted prisoners could be in danger of being dismantled. We'll talk to the head of the Innocence Commission on the other side of this break. When Chesa Boudin was elected as San Francisco's district attorney in 2019, he was part of a wave of progressive prosecutors who vowed to change the criminal justice system. As part of that, he established something called the Innocence Commission in 2020. Its task to evaluate cases where an incarcerated person claims they were wrongfully convicted. Thanks to their work, this man, Joaquin Syria, was exonerated after more than 30 years behind bars, after evidence came to light showing he was convicted of a murder he did not commit. Last month, Chesa Boudin was recalled. His tenure as DA ended just 5 days ago. Boudin's ouster is a setback for his movement to remake the city's justice system and could now lead to the end of the Innocence Commission he created. Today, a group of local officials urged the new district attorney, Brooke Jenkins, who fiercely criticized Boudin, to keep this experiment in justice reform intact. They also want to ensure that the panel remains independent from the DA's office and can continue to work as it has. With me now is Laura Bazelon. She's a professor at the University of San Francisco School of Law, and she chairs the San Francisco District Attorney's Innocence Commission. Professor Bazelon, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Jake.
So let's talk about the commission that you head. I have heard of wrongful conviction units all across the country. Why is this commission different from those?
It's one of a kind because it's an independent panel of experts and we exist external to the DA office. The other conviction units that you're referring to are internal. Some of them work well, but most of them don't. And that's because they're staffed by prosecutors who really are not very interested in getting to the truth if it's hard and it involves misconduct, for example, and instead really are ready to just check the box on a wrongful conviction and put the file away.
The strange part of how the United States justice system works really is, it's pretty unique in the world, right? That district attorneys are political offices. They are elected. They have to run on certain promises and certain political, deal with certain political third rails. And in this case, I wonder what you think the importance is of having a commission that is independent from it, as opposed to having DAs essentially charged with reviewing their own work as they do in other jurisdictions.
Right. It's sort of like asking a third grader to correct their own homework. They're incentivized to make it perfect and not acknowledge the mistakes that were made in the past. And I think what's unique about the commission is that our sole mission is to get to the truth, whatever that is. We're not beholden to anyone or anything. We offer our services pro bono. We are not employees, promotions, et cetera. It doesn't depend on our findings. We only care about getting to the bottom of what happened. And so because of that, we're really apolitical, and we should exist and be able to do our work regardless of who the head of the district attorney's office is. And I think that was really the motivation behind the ordinance that was introduced yesterday by the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, essentially saying to the interim DA, look, you may want to make some changes. However, there's this apolitical body who's been working extremely hard with a great deal of success to undo wrongful convictions, really successfully for the first time in San Francisco history. You should keep these folks on.
You're talking here, of course, about a commission that costs money. It costs the time of folks like you who volunteer or fundraise to make it possible. I mean, this is not a light undertaking. I guess I'm wondering, what lessons do you think there are for other cities around the country in the work you are doing, especially once they've seen this DA, who was such a face of sort of a progressive prosecutor, has been recalled? How do you make the case for moving this to other jurisdictions, expanding on this?
Sure. Well, Contra Costa County, which is to the east across the bay, it's a very large county in the Bay Area. They have expressed a lot of interest in adopting a similar type of model. And in fact, some of their high-ranking DAs have sat in, signing confidentiality agreements on some of our meetings. So this is a model that other jurisdictions are interested in. And while it was created by DA Boudin, and he had the vision to do that, and we're grateful, it should really outlast any particular DA's term. And I think we can point to our track record of success and say, we were presented with this case. This man, Joaquin Syria, went to court countless times over the years. At every turn, he was opposed, and no one listened to him. And we were just able to be completely independent and say, okay, let's look at the evidence. Let's review it painstakingly. Let's talk to these newly discovered witnesses, and we're going to make a recommendation. And to be clear, the DA doesn't have to do what we say, but our findings and recommendations are entitled to great weight. And you talked about expense. We're actually incredibly inexpensive in the sense that we all work for free except our staff attorney, and I raise the funds for her salary myself. And tell me a little bit about how it works. Let's say in the case of Joaquin Syria, the man who you helped to exonerate, we are looking here at a country with more than 3,000 exonerations since 1989. I mean, that's, incredible numbers of lost years, people's lives upended to the tune of 27,200 years lost to wrongful incarceration. If we're talking about numbers like that, how does a commission like yours go about its work? I'm used to the idea that prosecutors and investigators are on one side, defense attorneys on the other side, right? And that is how we sort of, through this adversarial system, get to the truth. But what you're doing is very different. How does it work? Walk me through how you did it with Joaquin Syria. It's a collaborative model. So what happens is that the DA's office sends us cases, and they say, these are cases where we have some concerns. We're not sure what happened, but maybe something's not right. We picked Joaquin's case to go first because it had the most evidence, because he had very capable lawyers, and because he had been incarcerated for over 3 decades. And then we reviewed tens of thousands of pages. We also, using funds I raised, hired experts to kind of explain, for example, why cross-racial identifications can go wrong, to talk about false confessions and coercion when teenagers are being interrogated, all integral to what happened to him. We also found some new witnesses and we interviewed them and recorded a key interview. And then we turned over all of our findings to the DA with an extremely detailed memo setting out the facts, our investigation, and then our conclusions, kind of applying the law. And this was about after 4.5 months. And we said, look, we've met over 57 hours and we have deliberated extensively and we have done all this work. And this is our conclusion and finding. And I can just contrast that with kind of what was happening in San Francisco before. There was a pretty famous wrongful conviction case that happened here fairly recently. The man's name was Jamal Truelove. And Jamal Truelove, even though very clearly innocent, the DA's office in San Francisco, prior to DA Boudin, they fought that conviction tooth and nail. They retried him after his conviction was overturned for prosecutorial misconduct and ineffective assistance of counsel. He was acquitted, and then he went on to sue the city and win $13 million. And sadly, that's traditionally how prosecutors handle these cases. They weaponize technicalities. They say 12 people convicted, regardless of the lying and the cheating and the stealing that went on to get that ill-gotten verdict. And then they defend. And this is a different model.
Professor Laura Bazelon, the head of the San Francisco Innocence Commission, who is hoping, obviously, that it can continue its work. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Coming up next, Instagram wants parents to scan their kids' faces to determine whether they are old enough to use the platform. But how old is old enough, and will this keep children safe? We'll break it all down in just a moment. Rapid innovation is one of the biggest reasons today's kids are growing up in a world so very different from that of their parents, particularly when it comes to smartphones, tablets, and social media networks like Instagram, TikTok, and Snapchat, which have drastically impacted the way children interact with the world around them and with each other. Now, in some ways, this can be great, as the experience of keeping up with ever-changing technology will have taught kids how to understand the newest and latest thing, expose them to all sorts of things. On the other hand, how do you protect a child who has almost quite literally the world at their hands? That was the concern of many lawmakers when they called Instagram CEO Adam Mosseri to testify on Capitol Hill last December. Namely, what are tech companies doing to protect children online? Last month, Instagram announced it's testing a new feature that uses artificial intelligence to age verify its youngest users. The technology allows Instagram to scan the child's face with their phone, they say, which determines if that child is over the age of 13. Now, 13 is the age Instagram has deemed appropriate. Children 12 and under are not allowed to use the platform, except, of course, many still do. There is, in fact, a pull quote here from Instagram, but I want to talk first to our guest. Dr. Dimitri Christakis is the head of, director of the Center for Child Health, Behavior and Development at Seattle Children's Research Institute and studies the effect of technology on children. Dr. Christakis, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Jake.
So let's talk, first of all, orient us as to your work. Tell me a little bit about what your fundamental findings have been when it comes to the effect of technology in the form of personal devices on children.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, because one of the challenges we face is that few of us, certainly not me, are in favor of eliminating all technology for all children. There's clearly potential upsides that need to be made available to all children, which is a separate issue because they clearly are not available equally to all children. But there are also very clear, demonstrable downsides. And nowhere is that more clear. I mean, researchers like myself have for many years now been trying to study the ill effects and have been very limited in the data we were able to harvest. But along come the Facebook files, which revealed that not only was Meta, Instagram's parent company, if you will, knowledgeable about all these ill effects, they were quite deliberately exploiting them. So there's every reason for people to be concerned.
And when you think about the effect on children, I'm thinking here about children as young as 3 years old playing a game on a phone. I mean, just sort of orient us there. What is that like, and how does it compare to past generations when a child's toy would be their primary fixation as opposed to a device?
Right. It's an interesting point, because I think a lot of people think of technologies as being this generation's toys. And when you think about young children, for example, with toys, one of the things we found in our lab is that the typical toddler with their favorite toy prior to digital technologies, whether it was books or dolls or blocks, would play with them for about 18 to 20 minutes a day on average. They will spend hours happily with their iPads. So that alone tells us there's something very, very different about this experience. It's true for toddlers. It's true for tweens. It's true for teens. For that matter, it's true for adults. The difference is something we've recognized for a long time. Children don't have the cognitive wherewithal, the cognitive fortitude to set up guardrails around a lot of their behaviors. That's the reason we regulate access to a lot of other products and services based on age. And we're not doing that here. And I think that's a mistake and potentially very dangerous. We're already seeing hundreds, thousands of cases across the country of teenagers and tweenagers who have been, sadly, driven as far as to suicide because of their experiences with Instagram, Facebook, et cetera.
And do you have a sense, as a researcher and someone who tracks the field closely, do you think that the field has a sense yet of whether the positive aspects of this, how they stack up against the possible negative aspects of this? We think about children who suddenly have exposure to cultures they could never have accessed otherwise. In theory, can learn all sorts of things they could never have accessed otherwise. And yet we also, as you mentioned, have the Facebook whistleblower last year basically coming out with all these internal research reports that find that there is a sort of a conflict of interest here, that a company that depends on bringing on new users may not be in the best position to make scientifically sound decisions about the effect that their product may be having on children. So I guess I'm wondering, for you, how do the good and bad stack up, or are we not in a place yet where we know?
Well, the sad reality is, if industry would only allow for some reasonable regulations and collaborate with unbiased scientists, such as myself and others, to evaluate and put safety measures in place, we could ensure that children get the good and minimize the harms. There's so many things that they could do, especially if they worked with dispassionate investigators who could be trusted, unlike the industry itself, to ensure that these products are safe and valuable for children. That's not been the model. And in fact, sadly, the United States has a long tradition of calling on industries to regulate themselves. I mean, the fact that Instagram is now coming forward and saying, okay, we're going to finally verify that children are 13 when they say they are, which they have not been interested in doing previously, is frankly too little too late. Because even if children are 13, and incidentally, I'm not convinced that this AI will work that well, nor that giving up video of your child to these companies is a good idea from a parent's perspective. But even if they are able to verify 13, it's not clear at all that 13 is a safe age for this particular product, the way it's currently designed and being used.
And let's just dig into that for a moment in just the last minute we have here. What is 13 for you as a researcher and a clinician? Is that, in fact, a turning point past which a child can be expected to use social media in a responsible way, to interact with technology in a healthy way?
So, absolutely. But you see, again, we can't make the mistake of being monolithic as we think of these things. Not all social media are the same. And in fact, we know now that Instagram has their own data telling them that their product puts certain children at risk. Did they use that to either redesign their product, put in safeguards, parental alerts, or did they bury it? They did the latter. And that's precisely why we need to ensure that they put safeguards in place in the future. They can do it if they want, but it's going to take external pressure for them to do so.
Yeah. Dr. Dimitri Christakis, thank you so much for being here. And thank you for making time for us. I'm Jake Ward in for Joshua Johnson. See you tomorrow. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.